Hello and welcome back to In Good Spirits, Episode 2, the podcast where we break down everything you need to know about whiskey and whiskey investments. Today, whether you're a whiskey enthusiast or just starting to explore the world of whiskey, this is the episode for you. Today, we're going to go over some of the most common questions people have about whiskey. What's the difference between Scotch, whiskey and bourbon? What's a first fill Sherry Hogshead? We'll break down that whole line. And what's the difference between single malts and blended whiskey? Firstly, if anybody is interested in just Whiskey Investments 101, please refer back to episode 1 where I break that down for you just from a very high level overview. But without further ado, let's dive right into whiskey and mystifying all of these strange words and concepts that you will come across. Now, these are common things that people will hear in the industry, whether you're just investing or just walking into a whiskey shop the first time. And hopefully at the end of this podcast, you'll all be experts yourselves, willing to impress your friends and family on your broader whiskey knowledge and how much you now know, but secretly you've just been listening into my podcast. Okay, so let's start with a simple but important question. What's the difference between Scotch, whiskey and bourbon? Are they the same thing or is there more to it? Well, here's the 101. Firstly, whiskey and whiskey are the same spirit, but the difference in spelling comes from just to regional preferences. Scotland, Canada and Japan spell it without an E, while Ireland and the US spell it with an E. No difference in taste, just a difference in spelling. My preference, I'm UK, I'm British, I've always gone without an E. Now, let's talk about Scottish whiskey, or Scotch whiskey, or just Scotch, depending on your preference. All come from Scotland and have to be made with specific regulations. To be called a Scotch, it has to be distilled and matured in Scotland for at least 3 years and a day. So if you've got a spirit that's 2 years and 50 days old, you are not allowed to call it a whiskey. It has to be called an aged spirit at that point. But as soon as it hits 3 years and 1 day, it's then called a Scotch. Scotch is known for its broad range of flavours, often with a smoky or peaty profile, especially if it's made on the Isle of Islay. And then if you're made in Speyside, Highlands and Lowlands, these all tend to be a bit softer, sweeter, but all have their own unique characteristics. And it can be a single malt or blend, and it's all typically made from barley. Bourbon, on the other hand, is an American whiskey or whiskey, however you want to spell it, and it has its own set of rules, different to Scotch. To be classified as a bourbon, it has to be made in the US, and it has to be made with at least 51% corn and aged in new charred oak barrels. These charred oak barrels gives it a sweet, rich flavour, notes of caramel, vanilla, whereas Scotch tends to be a bit more richer, as we kind of spoke about. But unlike Scotch whiskey, which is typically malted barley, bourbon also has corn, rye, and other grain ingredients mixed in with it. And then there's straight bourbon. So a straight bourbon is a whiskey that's been aged in a new charred oak barrels for at least 2 years. So a bourbon can technically be called a bourbon on day one, unlike a Scottish whiskey, which has to be aged at least 3 years and a day. But for it to be a straight bourbon, it has to be aged at least 2 years. So next time you're ever in a whiskey shop, have a look at a bottle. If you ever see the word bourbon or straight bourbon, you'll know how much it's been aged. So while all of these types of whiskey, the country of origin, the ingredients used and the aging process all contribute to their distinct characteristics, Scotch, whiskey and bourbon each have their own unique charm and their unique flavour and their own characteristics, which people love to go for. Now, let's move on to something a little bit more technical terms that you'll hear when you come to investing in whiskey, but also that most whiskey salesmen or just people in a whiskey shop might just use interchangeably that you might not understand. And one of the most common terms is first fill Sherry Hogshead or first fill bourbon hogshead. But what does all of that actually mean? Each part of that word or that sentence has a unique meaning and gives a certain tag as to what it is and how it's made and what is that whiskey is like. And so what the great thing about whiskey is, that if you've tried a whiskey with a certain flavour profile, even though it's from a slightly different distillery, you probably have a good 80-70% knowledge of what that whiskey would taste like, even without opening the bottle. And so this is how people then want to diversify their whiskey tastes, or they want to try different styles, is they know they like whiskey X because it's a first fill sherry hogshead, and then they like whiskey Y because it's aged in a first fill sherry hogshead. But the main difference is then it's just from a different distillery, and then they've played with that percentage of barley or corn or malt, and maybe just different years of age. So the first part, first fill. When we talk about first fill, we're referring not to a man called Phil or Jeff or anything like that. We're referring to how many times a cask has been used. So what does that mean? A first fill cask means that it's the first time the cask has been used to mature whiskey. This is important because the first time a cask is used, it imparts the most intense flavours to the whiskey. So a first fill cask will give you the richer, more complex flavours compared to a cask that's been reused multiple times. So if you see first fill, that means it's the first one gone in. Makes sense. If you see refill, that means it's not the first one, but it's any number after that. So second, third, fourth, fifth. And normally after the fifth one, most of the flavour from the barrel has already imparted its flavour into the whiskey. And so master distillers tend not to use barrels after they've been used 5 or 6 times. They tend to, recycle them, dismantle them, and use them for a different process later on. And the classic example of first fill, actually, is bourbon. And we spoke about bourbon having to use brand new oak charred barrels. And what the whiskey industry really is good at doing is recycling materials that it's already used. And so because bourbon has to be made in these new casks, it's kind of a one-stop thing. They use it and then they suddenly can't use the barrel anymore because it has to be a brand new cask made every time. And so what Scotch whiskey distilleries do is they tend to buy those used barrels. And so a whiskey barrel that's used in America tends to find itself in Scotland, and it might be there for then the next 100, 200 years, depending on how long they want to mature that cask in there. But moving on, sherry cask. So we've got first fill sherry cask. A sherry cask is a barrel that has been previously used to age sherry wine, which is fortified wine from Spain. These casks are often made from oak, and the wine has a significant impact on its flavour and imparts its flavour on the whiskey. Sherry casks are famous for adding rich and fruity and sweet flavours, dried fruits, nuts, etc., and adding maybe a little bit of spice to the whiskey. And when a whiskey is matured in a sherry cask, it often takes on these notes, but also its colour. So some of the colours that people love to see is when it goes really, really dark and red and all those other kind of darker tones to it. But actually, looking at whiskey, sherry is the only one that gives it that dark flavour. So if you're looking at a whiskey that's a bourbon or used from ex-bourbon casks, it's actually not going to pick up any of those dark tannins because it's not had it in previously. It's not a sherry cask. And so when you're looking at a bottle of whiskey, a lot of people think, the darker the colour, therefore the better the whiskey, or the more it's been aged, which is a common misconception. It only gets that darkness and that richness from the sherry cask. So you could have a 25-year-old Scotch whiskey that's only been maturing in ex-bourbon barrels, be this lovely kind of deeper golden yellow, but may not look as rich or as old as another whiskey because it's not got as many dark redness and richness to it. And most people think, that must be the barrel giving its flavour, which is not true. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of a secret here. Whiskey industry does use colouring in their whiskey. So sometimes for their younger age stuff, they put in caramel colouring. And so they know that people look at the colour and think that means quality. And so the whiskey industry add this caramel colouring in to a lot of their kind of core ranges to give it a darker colour. So people then go, great, higher age or darker colour, therefore better whiskey, which is totally incorrect in your thinking. So whenever a whiskey person is trying to sell you something and say, hey, the colour's darker just because it's aged in a bourbon barrel, they're completely wrong. It's only got the colour, A, from a sherry cask or a different type of cask other than bourbon, or B, it's been using caramel colouring. Now, the final part, hogshead. So, we've gone from first fill sherry cask, hogshead. Now, a hogshead is a type of cask using for maturing whiskey, and it's a bit larger than a typical barrel. While a standard barrel is about 200 litres, a hogshead is typically 250 to 300 litres. It's not just about the size though. The bigger the cask allows, the more subtle interaction between the whiskey and the wood, which means a more balanced and maturation process. So if you think about the surface area of the whiskey versus the contact of the barrel, the smaller the cask, the more intense flavours you're going to get, versus a bigger cask, the less intense flavours you're going to get. And so a lot of the time, distillers tend to use smaller casks of whiskey to impart heavy flavours and heavy sweetness very quickly. Or if they're going to have something that wants a bit more of a balance and a bit more of a softness to it, they use larger casks. But as a whole, hogshead is the most common barrel that's used across the whiskey industry and is a very standardised casks. Now, I'm just going to touch on the different types of casks, because a lot of the time people just say a barrel of whiskey. But a barrel of whiskey is a specific amount of litres and a specific size. So a few of the core sizes are an octave cask, which is only 50 litres, a quarter cask, 125, barrel, 200 litres, a hogshead, 250 to 300, a puncheon, which is 450 litres, a butt, which is 500 litres, and a fordra, which is 1,000 to 2,000 litres. But like I said, the common ones that I've always used, or used 90% of the time, is either a hogshead, a butt, or a barrel. So when someone says, I've got a barrel of whiskey, well, are they literally talking about a barrel, which is 200 litres? Or do they mean they have a barrel of whiskey, i.e. a certain barrel size, which is actually a hogshead? So they've actually got more whiskey than they thought. So that's why being precise with the language in the industry is quite key. Everybody talks about cask investments, casks of whiskey, rather than barrels of whiskey. And it's very easy to interchange them very quickly because a barrel is a set size in the industry. So when you see first fill sherry hogshead, it means that the whiskey has been aged in a relatively large cask, which was used for the first time to mature sherry wine and is now imparting those rich, fruity flavours to the whiskey. These casks are highly sought after by distilleries looking for depth and complexity in their whiskey. But we'll touch on that maybe next week in Whiskey Strategies. The whole phrase first fill sherry hogshead implies a certain flavour profile that certain distilleries will look for, but also how much your barrel of whiskey, cask of whiskey, is worth. There we go, correcting myself already. So whenever a broker or anybody is quoting a whiskey barrel to you, you should be able to think about this in these three logical steps. First fill, how many times it has been used. Sherry, bourbon, muscatel, port, whatever it's previously been used in the barrel, what has previously the barrel has been used for, and cask. So hogshead, octave, barrel, butt. Think of those three concepts. What's been used, what's been had in it, and what size of the barrel that you're buying is. And now the classic question I always got from working in the whiskey shop, and I keep getting asked over and over again, single malts versus blended whiskey. Now, we can have a whole 10-hour discussion about single malts versus blends in terms of which is better, why it's better, is there a difference, etc. But we're not going to touch on all that. I'm just going to tell you what single malts are, what blends are, and maybe just some of my own thoughts at the end. Single malt whiskey is made from just one type of grain, malted barley, and is produced at a single distillery. It's made through a process of malting, mashing, fermenting, distilling and aging, and all of that takes place under one roof-ish. Single malts are typically known for their unique character and flavours, influenced by the distillery style and the regions they've made in, particularly in Scotland where you've got Highland, Lowland, Speyside and Islay. You'll often hear names like Glenfiddich, Macallan, Glenlivet. These are all Speyside styles of whiskey. And then in Islay you've got Lefroy, Lagavulin, Coal Isla. These are more peated styles of whiskey. Blended whiskey, on the other hand, is a mix of different types of whiskey. It's usually a combination of single malt whiskey and grain whiskey. The key with blended whiskey is that it's crafted to create a smooth, balanced flavour profile. Some of the world's most popular whiskies, like Johnnie Walker and Chivas Regal, are blends, and they often provide a more approachable option for people new to whiskey, while a single malt might have a bit more complex, and blended whiskies are often smoother and richer and easier to drink. But again, if we take our first Fill Sherry Hogshead cask as an example of the whiskey industry, single malt, as the name suggests, single distillery. Blend means multiple distilleries or multiple grains used. So actually, when we talk about single malt whiskey, it's kind of a little bit of a lie to say it's not a blend. Because a lot of distilleries, let's just take Glenfiddich for example, and their 12-year-old, they'll be producing tens of thousands of barrels of this. And what they will do is they will actually blend their own whiskey with each other. So maybe 12-year-olds with more 12-year-olds, or if they've got some 13-year-olds they want to put back into it because they've got an excess supply, or they want to water down their whiskey from 50% down to 40%, or they want to add in a certain other flavour profile for it. So it might be 10 years aged in bourbon, then 2 years in a sherry cask. Because it's all made at the same distillery, it can still be called a single malt. So when we say single malts are better than blends, let's just take a step back. Single malts could be blended just from the same distillery. So whenever you see people or your friends just go, oh, I don't want to try a blend because it's obviously worse, they've probably not had the right blend and the right price. Because blended is so cheap, I can walk into Tesco now and buy a Chivas Regal 12 for about £21, whereas single malts tend to start at £25. Actually, £25 for a single malt and a £21 for a blend is pretty much same in flavour and same in quality. It's both poor, if I'm being totally honest. But if you spent £80 on a single malt and £80 on a blend, you will find that there are some fantastic expressions out there that are really, really enjoyable. And in fact, you can actually get quite aged blended whiskey a lot cheaper than single malts. And so I would encourage anybody to try aged blended whiskey, just as to get a feel as to what they would like and how actually that evolves. Because as a distillery using single malt, you are kind of stuck using your own stuff, whereas blended stuff, they don't care where it's from, they're just looking to craft the best whiskey. And because they tend to buy casks which are not wanted from those distilleries for whatever reason, they can just go about their business making some fantastic stuff. So don't think that single malts are always better than blends. There are some fantastic blends, and I encourage anybody to spend significant money, no more than £80 on a blend, and see what they think, because you'll be surprised of what's out there. And I don't just mean go and buy a Ballantine's, subtle hint to my own surname, or a Chivas Regal 18-year-old, or a Royal Salute 21. Go to a whiskey shop, ask them for an aged blended whiskey, and you'll find some fantastic stuff, and they will certainly point you in the right direction for some unique and latest expressions. So if I was just going to quickly summarise all of that, main difference is single malt whiskey is from one distillery and made by malted barley, whereas blended whiskey is made from multiple distilleries and can include grain. Both have their place in the whiskey world, both are fantastic whiskies and offer kind of unique profiles of flavour that I encourage everybody who's listening to go out and try. Alrighty then, that's a wrap for today's episode. We've covered the differences between Scotch whisky and bourbon, looked into what's a first fill sherry hogshead, and the distinct differences between single malts and blend. I hope that this helps you and clears up some confusion about the whiskey world, and next time you go to a whiskey shop or talking to a broker, you're equipped with the knowledge to kind of understand what they're saying and, translate some of the stuff that they kind of just say to you that maybe they've not expressed and broken down for you. Or if you're next time at the dinner table or Christmas dinner and a whiskey is given to you as a present, you'll see a whiskey that says aged in first fill Oloroso casks or first fill bourbon casks, and you can break it down to everybody as to why it's got a certain flavour profile. Or if someone's trying it out as a single malt and say, this is this flavour for this reason, you can break it all down for them and show off all of that wonderful knowledge that you've learned here today. Thank you for listening. It's been a really fun episode to talk through. These are the common questions I get all the time, not only when I was working in the whiskey shop, but just still what I get generally when talking about whiskey and, when people just enjoy the drinks themselves. And I hope this demystifies some of the phrases and sayings that you might see in the whiskey world that you certainly will have to remember and will have to note down when talking to brokers and when wanting to develop your whiskey strategy yourselves in the future. Thank you very much for listening. Please like, share, subscribe to the YouTube channel, to Spotify, and I'll catch you next time for more whiskey insights, more whiskey knowledge, and more development of whiskey strategies. Thank you for listening, and good night.